Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to East Central Missouri and the world, and welcome to the James Strong Show podcast, podcast number 290. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for making us a part of your day. I appreciate it. This podcast was recorded on the morning of Saturday, October the 29th, from the James Strong Studio in Western St. Charles County. Topic of today's essay, British Politics 101. And I mean, this week, the UK elected a new prime minister, Rishi Sunak, and we're going to go ahead and go into detail about who he is, where he came from, his rise in power in British politics. We're also going to talk about where his main, the thing he was known most for is being the Chancellor of the Exchequer. What the heck is that, you may ask? It's a cool sounding title, isn't it? The Chancellor of the Exchequer. We'll talk about what that is, and we'll also talk about the Parliament of the UK and how it's different from that in the US. So we'll talk about their new Prime Minister, the title Chancellor of the Exchequer, what he does or what they do, and what it means, and the British Parliament system in general, how it's similar to ours and how it's quite different as well. Before we get into that, a handful of items I wanted to discuss first. First of all, it's been a long time since I've given an update on the restoration for the Jaguar, the 1951 Jaguar Mark 7 that my father and I have been working on. The main reason is we've kind of hit a snag, and it's probably been months since I mentioned this, and basically the car was in limbo. The engine was being rebuilt, the transmission was being rebuilt, and the body of the car is finished, okay? It's ready to have the engine and transmission installed. Well, they're both finally finished. They were done at separate shops. They're now coming together perhaps maybe as soon as yesterday. I would say this upcoming week for sure. They need to be installed into the car. Then the carburetors need to be rebuilt. The flywheel needs to be machined, the clutch installed, and then it comes back to me. And I get to put it back together and get it running. So that's where we are. Really no updates, and I'm really not going to there's really not much to say until I get the car back into the shop so I can start doing more work on it. Now, when is that going to be? I'd like to think in the next couple of weeks, but just the way this whole project is gone, it may be the end of the year. I mean, it doesn't sound like there's much going on, much that has to be done, but this has been a very slow process, okay? Far slower than I thought. My original goal, if you remember, was to have this thing on the road by the end of the year. Not the end of the year 2022, the end of the year 2021, okay? I would consider myself fortunate if I got it back to my shop by the end of the year 2022. So a slow progress. Most of what needs to be done on my end is done. I will say that for 2 weekends in a row, my father has been in the shop helping me clean up and restore the brake parts to a 72-year-old automobile, 72, almost 73-year-old automobile. Have to be cleaned, taken apart, cleaned, and restored so we can put them back together. That's a large task. Today, my father's scheduled to meet up with me at the shop again, and some of these brake parts have broken bolts in them, so we need to remove those bolts and perhaps get these components ready to install onto the car, because just as important of getting a car running down the road is making sure that it can stop when it needs to, okay? Because if it can run down the road, it needs to stop as well. So there's the latest on the Jaguar Mark 7 update. Elon Musk, who I've mentioned this before, he is our modern day Thomas Edison, okay? On a scale of 1 to 10, by smarts, he may be a 26. Joe Rogan famously made the comment when asked, Do aliens walk among us? He says, yes, they do. And he's named Elon Musk because he's just off the chart smart and knows more than you, me, and everybody combined. No. Well, this week he bought Twitter for $44 billion. And I'm thinking to myself, why would he do that? I have no idea why he would do that. And he said he didn't do it to make money. But a $44 billion toy is going to need a lot of oversight to a guy who already runs Tesla, who already runs SpaceX. So this guy already runs the car company with the most worth in the country, SpaceX, which basically is in charge of launching the rockets for the world, and a variety of other companies, the Boring Company, some of these solar cell companies. He's got so many irons in the fire, it's not even funny. But why would he pay $44 billion for something like this? I don't know, but I suspect we're going to find out. On a closer to home note, St. Charles County, a suburb of St. Louis for those of you outside of the East Central Missouri area, has gotten a Total Wine shop. Now, what is that, you ask? Well, for those of you who like to imbibe, especially those of you who enjoy wine, Total Wine is, I don't know, can I say the Mecca of wine? Mecca being the Muslim holy place, and Muslims don't drink, so I don't know if you could say that, but I guess I just did. It's the best place in the world to buy wine and other alcoholic beverages. We have one out here in St. Charles County now. I've been twice so far. And the second time, I achieved something I've never achieved before while walking into a Total Wine store. And that is, I walked away spending less than $100 because it is your ultimate kid in the candy shop place. My wine cooler is now totally full with with bottles on the side, just waiting in place to be put in as others are used. Okay. One of my recently favorite wines is it's a grape called Tannat, Tannat. Yeah, it's a palindrome, spelled the same frontwards and backwards, but it's from Uruguay. And it's hard to find an Uruguay Tannat. In fact, I've just found one wine store in the St. Louis area that even carries a Tannat. They carry one, and it's pretty good. Total Wine has 5 Tannats, okay? I bought 3 of them. I haven't tried them yet, but I'm looking forward to it. Another thing I was able to find is a beer called Kronenbourg. Now, you've never heard of Kronenbourg, probably. It's a French beer. There's several types. The type I like is called Kronenbourg 1664. And it's one of the most popular beers in Britain, which is odd because it's a French beer. And if you think of beer, or if you think of Britain and things to drink, you think of beer. But 2 of the most popular beers in Britain are Kronenbourg and Beck's, a French beer and a German beer. Go figure. But it's wonderful stuff. And occasionally you can get it over here in the States. You can get it in Canada. Occasionally you can get it in the States. But when it's in the States, it comes in a green glass bottle like Heineken. Translation, it's got that skunky taste to it, okay? Any beer in a clear glass bottle is gonna have that skunky taste because the light gets to it and it turns it. I found Kronenbourg in half-liter cans, and I popped one last night, and it was wonderful. Not as good as draft, not as good as tap, but certainly much better than the bottles because no light had gotten to it and it did not have that skunky taste. So if you get a chance, if you like wine, if you like beer, if you like to imbibe, do yourself a favor, stop by Total Wine and see if you're disciplined enough to walk out of there spending less than $100. I rarely am. Travel this week. This week I went to southeast Missouri and northeast Arkansas on business. Business is good out there. Business is interesting. Challenges continue to pop up when traveling, but by now they're just part of the deal. 2 things that did happen. Okay, had 2 supply chain problems. Recently, let me back up just a little bit. On Saturdays, after I do my podcast, I generally go to the shop to work on the Jaguar parts, okay? The Jaguar parts, okay, for a little while. Sometimes a couple hours, sometimes more than a couple hours. But I go by a gas station that has pretty good coffee, so I pick up a cup of coffee on the way. And as a little treat to myself, they've got these little cups of like a chocolate caramel creamer, okay? I throw a couple of those in, fill up my coffee cup, and I go to the shop. They've been out of the creamers. And I've been on these people, look, when are you going to get creamers? And they say, yeah, the chocolate creamers. We don't know. We can't get them. Okay. Supply chain problems. While I was in southeast Missouri today, pulled into a truck stop, the Pilot truck stop in Hayti, Missouri, right off of 55. And I thought I'd get a cup of coffee. Maybe find little chocolate cups that the dopey people up here in East Central Missouri don't have. Well, guess what? They were out of them too. So I guess it's I'm not going to say a nationwide problem, but at least a Eastern Missouri problem, because they didn't have them down there either. They were out. The other thing I found that they had out is I was at a restaurant, and they were out of Caesar dressing. Yeah, I ordered a Caesar salad. Sorry, we can't give you Caesar salad. We're out of Caesar dressing. I said, how can you be out of Caesar dressing? Okay, this was at a local chain, not a local chain, but a national chain, Longhorn Steakhouse. I said, how could you be out of Caesar dressing? Well, a lot of people order Caesar salads. And I looked at the lady. She said, okay, look, we're supposed to get a truck Monday. We didn't get a truck Monday. We're supposed to get our truck tomorrow. What do you mean you didn't get your truck? I mean, the truck has all the stuff you need to run your restaurant, and it didn't show up? That's bizarre. That, friends, is just very bizarre. And it just goes to just as chapter 27 in the supply chain problem that we have. And I have no idea if and when it's ever going to go away. Read an interesting article in the Wall Street Journal today. It was an editorial, and the Wall Street Journal, like I've mentioned before, is the only publication that I really pay attention to the editorial writers. I think they're better than most. I think they have something to say. And this particular writer, his name escapes me, but he wrote about the UFO phenomenon. Now, when you read about UFOs in the Wall Street Journal, you need to pay attention, because that means they're kind of important. But what this guy has to say is what's going on with all this UFO stuff. And he criticized the whole full transparency by the government thing. Okay, the government has released all these papers. He says they haven't released anything. He said the government and this is his opinion, of course, but his opinion is the government knows fully what's going on with these UFOs. But they're not telling us. He said they know 100%, beyond a shadow of a doubt, what's going on with all these UAPs and everything else. And he has an idea, and his idea is not wrong. And his idea is based on a theory, phenomenon, whatever you want to call it, called Occam's Razor. Now, I've heard the term probably. If you don't know what it means, I'll tell you what it is. Occam's Razor is basically, look, if you're trying to solve a problem, if you're trying to find out what's going on, the solution almost always is the simplest, easiest, most basic one. If you go off on tangents, if you go off on, if you try to put together conspiracy theories, you're probably way away from the real truth. And using Occam's Razor, this editorial writer says, look, here's what's going on with these UFOs, these UAPs. If you look at the facts are that they're being sighted by all these Navy, Marine, Army, Air Force pilots, primarily in U.S. airspace, primarily around military bases. and they don't know what they are. The government has admitted, look, there's something and we don't know what they are. So the government has admitted to them being there. And here's what he asks, and they're legitimate. It's a legitimate question. He says, why are they only around military bases? Why is this the only place they're being sighted? And only in our atmosphere? Why aren't they being sighted around the moon, around our satellites, away from military bases? And his theory is they're around military bases because these are all military projects. So the editorial in it kind of makes sense. It's not space aliens. It's not the Chinese. It's not the Russians. It's us. Now, what is it? He doesn't know. But the government knows what it is. Maybe they're drones. Maybe it's augmented reality or artificial intelligence, something that that's really not there, but it shows that it's there. Maybe it's something that shows up on radar but isn't really there. Maybe it's, who knows? Like I said, augmented reality or artificial intelligence. Maybe it's something like that. Because, in his theory being, because they only show up around military bases, maybe the government is letting the military pilots see these and letting them ask questions just to see what the reaction will be. Not a bad theory, by the way. Last but not least, before we get into British Politics 101, I want to go ahead and make a note on the economy. And one of the smartest guys in politics, who I don't necessarily agree with, but he was definitely one of the smartest guys in politics, was James Carville. And James Carville ran, I shouldn't say is, because he's still involved in politics. He's not dead, and he's still a pretty sharp guy. But James Carville ran the Clinton campaign, and basically he was the one that coined the phrase, "It's the economy, stupid." And he couldn't be more right. Because you can talk about abortion, you can talk about climate change, you can talk about any of these other issues that are on the forefront. But compared to the economy, it's a little more than white noise. Because the economy is bad. If you can't pay your bills, if you can't do what you want to do, if it's a hardship to fill your car up with gasoline, if it's a hardship to make your mortgage payment, if it's a hardship to pay your utility bills, that, my friends, is the number one concern of almost everybody. And I will go ahead and go out on a limb, and I'll say what nobody else is saying, that we are in a recession right now. And the reason I say that is, and listen to Professor Strong on this, please, because I'm here to tell you, I'm right. If you disagree with me, I'm sorry, but you're just wrong. Because the definition of a recession has always been 2 straight quarters of the economy declining. And we had that in the first quarter and the second quarter. Well, now these economists are saying, yeah, that happened, but the economy's still good. Okay, it's like saying the baseball team lost 5-4, but the team that had 4, they had more base hits than the team that had 5, so they won too. No. The definition of a baseball game is whoever scores the most points after the end of the game wins. The definition of a recession is 2 straight quarters of negative growth. You're in a recession, period. Now, we had good growth in the third quarter. Those numbers came out this week. And we had good growth, kind of. If you remove from that growth gas and oil exports, we had no growth to a third quarter of decline. Now, what does that mean? That means, friends, we are in a recession. Now, that doesn't mean that that everyone has hard times. That doesn't mean that the sky is falling and we must tell the king. But that means that we're in a recession. And I say that it's going to continue, maybe for quite some time. Now, again, I'm not saying that Katie bar the door, we're going into a depression, or even we're going to have a great recession like we had in 2008. I'm not saying that. But here's the thing. Here's how business works. Business is in business to make money. I think everybody agrees, okay? It's a global economy, okay? And if revenue is down, as revenue continues to decline, expenses have to be cut. That's the only way to make a profit, because profit is, what is it? It's revenue minus expenses. What's left over is profit. That's business 101. Okay. The stock market this week has rallied. Now, will it continue to rally? Don't know. But why is it continuing to rally if interest rates aren't going down and revenue continues to fall? Because maybe that business has a plan to fix this problem. If revenue is down, you have to cut expenses. And what's the biggest expense for most businesses? That's right. It's people. I know the job market is wonderful right now. It's been wonderful for quite some time, but the biggest expense is people. Look for these companies to start massive layoffs really soon. Okay. Mark Zuckerberg, the head of Meta, Facebook. Okay. He's lost upwards of $100 billion recently. $100 billion this guy has lost. And he's not cut staff yet. How long do you think, how many more billions of dollars do you think he's going to lose before he starts cutting staff? I suspect he'll cut staff real soon, perhaps as soon as this week. And if he starts, others will too. So here's Professor Strong's advice. If you have a job, keep it. If you're looking at retirement, postpone it. If you're looking at jumping to a new job, reconsider it unless it's a great opportunity. Are there bad times ahead? I didn't say that. I said we're in a recession and we're going to continue in that recession for quite some time. That doesn't necessarily mean bad times are ahead. If you have a job, I think you're going to be fine. Now, if you don't have a job, that's not a good thing. So if you don't have a job, bad times are ahead for you. The simple solution to that, keep the job. Look out for number one, because things never, ever, 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 never, ever, ever get better when your main source of income goes away. Okay, that's it. 23 minutes of pontificating. Now let's get into the essay for today, British Politics 101. The new Prime Minister, his name is Rishi Sunak, and I think it was the New York Post, no, UK Sun, I think. Rishi Sunak is his name, and they came out with the moniker Rishi Rich, off of the U.S. Richie Rich, cartoon character. Why do they call him Rishi Rich? Well, let me tell you a bit about this guy. He's the new Prime Minister of the UK. He was born in May of 1980. Which puts him at 42 years old. That's it. He's a young guy. He's been the PM now since the 25th of October. He's been the leader of the Conservative Party, the Tories in the UK, since the 24th of October. And before he was Prime Minister, Sunak served as the Chancellor of the Exchequer from 2020 to 2022 and Chief Secretary of the Treasury before that. He's been a Member of Parliament, an MP, from Richmond and Yorks since 2015. He's the youngest prime minister since the 19th century and the first prime minister to be appointed by King Charles III. Sunak was born in Southampton, at Southampton, UK, to parents of Indian descent. They migrated to Britain, not from India, but from East Africa back in the 60s. He was educated at Westminster College, studied philosophy, politics, and economics at Lincoln College in Oxford. He earned an MBA from Stanford University and was a Fulbright Scholar. While at Stanford, he met his future wife, Akshata Murthy. Who is she? Daughter of a billionaire, N.R. Murthy. Now, Sunak and his wife are the 222nd richest people in Britain, with a combined fortune of almost £750 million as of last year, as of earlier this year, I should say. After graduating college, Sunak worked for Goldman Sachs, later as a partner in the hedge fund's Children's Investment Management Fund and the Tellini Partners. Sunak was elected to the House of Commons in Richmond in North Yorkshire in the 2015 election, succeeding William Hague. Sunak supported Brexit in the 2016 referendum on EU membership. He was appointed by Theresa May, her second government, as Parliamentary Undersecretary of State for Local Government in the 2018 reshuffle. He voted three times in favor of Prime Minister May's Brexit withdrawal agreement. After May resigned, Sunak supported Boris Johnson's campaign to become Conservative leader. After Johnson became Prime Minister, Sunak was appointed Chief Secretary of the Treasury and then Chancellor of the Exchequer. Now, as Chancellor of the Exchequer, Sunak was promoted to the government's financial responsibilities, and he was in charge of the COVID-19 pandemic. He resigned as Chancellor of the Exchequer in July of this year, followed by Johnson's resignation amid a government crisis. Sunak stood in the Conservative Party leadership election to replace Johnson, but then lost the members' vote to Liz Truss. See, in the UK, the people don't elect the Prime Minister, the party in charge does. Now, after Truss's resignation, amid another government crisis, Sunak was elected unopposed as leader of the Conservative Party and was appointed Prime Minister on 25 October of this year, becoming the first British Prime Minister of Indian and Hindu descent to hold that position. Now, here's where the UK is different from the US. They mentioned that briefly. Now, in the U.S., the biggest story of President Barack Obama's 8-year tenure was, wow, the first black guy elected president, which was a distraction at best. It's good to say it. Okay, he's the first black man elected president. Okay, done. Move on. They've moved on. We never did. In fact, if you read history books, what's the greatest thing that Barack Obama did in his whole presidency? He was born black, which is stupid because we concentrate on that so much here in this country. His parents were Hindus and of Indian descent, but his parents didn't even come from India. His grandparents came from India. His father was actually born in Kenya, his mother in Tanganyika, which is now Tanzania, okay? And his grandparents moved to Africa from India back in the 1930s. So his parents weren't even born in India. His grandparents moved to Africa. Then his parents in the 1960s moved to England, okay? So they're British, okay? That's it. They're British people. To move on about Sunak, he worked as an analyst for investment bank Goldman Sachs. That was between 2001 and 2004. He then worked for a hedge fund management firm called the Children's Investment Management Fund. He became a partner in 2006. He left with another colleague to form Tellini Partners, another hedge fund. He then worked with his father-in-law, N.R. Murthy, to run another business called, what's the name of the business that he ran? It doesn't say. Or another business. He worked for his father-in-law, the billionaire, okay? So that was a big deal. He was elected to Parliament in 2014. We talked about that. But basically, that's the skinny on Rishi Sunak, a young guy. And the main reason they elected him is because Liz Truss, how long was she prime minister? 4 weeks, 6 weeks, something like that, 44 days, I forget, not very long. And basically, her financial plans were a mess, so she quit. So if the main reason you don't like Liz Truss is because of her finances, who do you want to elect? the top finance guy in the country, who was Rishi Sunak. And again, he was Chancellor of the Exchequer. Now, you ask, what in God's name is the Chancellor of the Exchequer? It sounds very cool. It's often been abbreviated to just be called the Chancellor. They've shortened it. But it's a senior minister to the crown within the government of the United Kingdom and head of His Majesty's Treasury. Hard to say His Majesty's because for many years we said Her Majesty. Now it's His Majesty because England has a king. UK has a king. As one of the 4 great offices of state, the Chancellor is a high-ranking member of the British cabinet and third in ministerial rankings behind the Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister. So he's the number 3 guy in the country. I guess you could compare him to our our Secretary of the Treasury, okay, which in this country, it's way down on the list. In the UK, it's way up there on the list. The guy who handles the purse strings probably should be higher up on the list. Now, what is he responsible for? He's responsible for all economic and financial matters. The role is equivalent to a finance minister in other countries. Like I said, Treasury Secretary in ours. In the 18th and early 19th century, it was common for the Prime Minister to also serve as Chancellor of the Exchequer. Okay? The Chancellor is the 3rd oldest major state office in England in British history, and in recent times has come to be the most powerful office in British politics after the Prime Minister. They originally carried responsibility for Exchequer, the medieval English institution for collecting and auditing royal revenue. In fact, the earliest surviving records, which are the results of the Exchequer's audit, date from, get this is how long this position's been around, 1129 to 1130, under King Henry the First. That's how long that position's been around, since not Henry VIII, Henry the First. Okay. Now, a previous chancellor, what do they do? What are their responsibilities? Robert Lowe, who was a previous chancellor back in the 1870s, described the office as, I will quote, "The Chancellor of the Exchequer is a man whose duties make him more or less of a taxing machine. He's entrusted with a certain amount of misery, which is his duty to distribute as fairly as he can." Now, the Chancellor has considerable control over other departments, as it's the Treasury that sets departmental expenditure limits, in other words, budgets. The amount of power given to this individual chancellor depends on their personal forcefulness, their status within the party, and their relationship with the Prime Minister. Case in point, Gordon Brown was Chancellor of the Exchequer starting in 1997, had a large personal power base within the party. Now, who took advantage of that? Tony Blair. He kept Gordon Brown as Chancellor of the Exchequer for 10 years, which allowed him to stay as Prime Minister for 10 years. Now, this has strengthened a pre-existing trend towards the Chancellor occupying a second, number 2 position in government. One part of the Chancellor's key roles involves the framing of the annual budget. Okay, he's responsible for the budget. Now, although the Bank of England is now responsible for setting interest rates, the Chancellor also plays an important part in the monetary policy structure. He sets the inflation target, which the banks must set interest rates to meet. Under the Bank of England Act of 1998, the Chancellor has the power of appointment of 4 of the 9 members of the bank's Monetary Policy Committee, the so-called external members. That's a lot of power for one guy. That's a huge amount of power for one guy, folks. That, in a nutshell, is the job of Chancellor of the Exchequer. He's basically the number 1 money man in the UK and is basically number 2 in the country after the Prime Minister. Now you say to yourself, well, I thought the King or the Queen was the number 1 person in the UK. Yes and no. And that leads us into part 3 of this, the Parliament of the United Kingdom, and how do they run their government? What is it all about? Is it like ours? Is it similar to ours? Yes and no. Let's talk about that briefly. And we talk about that, then the offices of Chancellor of the Exchequer and Prime Minister will be a little bit more clear. The Parliament of the United Kingdom, it's the supreme legislative body of the United Kingdom, the Crown dependents, and the British overseas territories. Okay, it alone, the Parliament alone, possesses legislative supremacy and therefore ultimate power over all other political bodies in the UK and the overseas territories. Parliament has three parts consisting of the sovereign, that's the Crown and Parliament, the House of Lords, and the House of Commons. So the Crown, the King or Queen, House of Lords, House of Commons. Now, both Houses of Parliament, Lords and Commons, meet in separate chambers in the Palace of Westminster, in the city of Westminster, which is an inner borough of the city of London. The House of Lords includes two different members, the House of Spiritual, consisting mostly of senior bishops in the Church of England, and the Lords Temporal, consisting mainly of life peers appointed by the sovereign, and 92 hereditary peers, either by virtue of holding a royal office or being elected by their fellow hereditary peers. In other words, it's a good old boys club. Now, by the way, our Senate was similar to that. Our Senate used to be appointed, not elected, until 1912. That was the 17th Amendment. So the House of Lords, basically, it's the bishops of the Church of England, the important bishops of the Church of England, and buddies of the king, and buddies of the king. Okay? Our Senate kind of used to be that way. So their House of Lords and House of Commons is a whole lot like our Senate and House. The Senate, we didn't elect senators until after 1912, the 17th Amendment. Before the 17th Amendment that let the people elect senators, they were appointed by the state legislators. In other words, in the state of Missouri, where we have predominantly Republican representatives, there would have been no chance of ever electing a Democratic senator because the legislative body of the states appointed the senator. Now, the House of Commons, which is different from the House of Lords, that's an elected chamber with elections to 650 single-member constituencies held every 5 years or so. By constitutional convention, all government ministries, including the Prime Minister, are members of the House of Commons, or, less commonly, the House of Lords. So they can be members of the House of Lords, but probably aren't. Now, with the global expansion of the British Empire, the UK Parliament has shaped the political system of many countries as ex-colonies. By the way, we're an ex-colony, remember? And the House of Commons and the House of Lords was around before 1776. And so, actually, the UK parliamentary system has been called the mother of parliaments because they were basically the first. In theory, the UK's supreme legislative power is often vested in Crown and Parliament. However, the Crown, the King, normally acts on the advice of the Prime Minister, and the powers of the House of Lords are limited only to delaying legislation. Thus, their power is de facto vested in the House of Commons. Now, the Parliament of Great Britain was formed in 1707 following the ratification of the Treaty of Unions by Acts of the Unions and passed by the Parliament of England, which the Parliament of England, by the way, was established in 1215. And the Parliament of Scotland, part of it, 1235. So that's how long they've been around, okay? So again, in theory, the king has ultimate power, but the king never makes decisions unless advised by the prime minister, and the prime minister acts as per Parliament. Now, the Parliament of Great Britain and England, Great Britain and Ireland, that was created in 1801. But then Ireland decided they didn't want to be part of Great Britain anymore. In fact, in 1918, there was a general election in Ireland that showed a landslide victory for the Irish Republican Party Sinn Féin, which is still around. And they vowed in their manifesto to establish an independent Irish republic. This was just 1918, folks, just a little over 100 years ago. All right. In 1922, pursuant to the Anglo-Irish Treaty, the Revolutionary Irish Republic was replaced by the Irish Free State, recognized by Westminster as independent, and while Northern Ireland would remain British, and in 1927, Parliament was then renamed the Parliament of the United Kingdom and Great Britain, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And by the way, that war that started in 1918, for all intents and purposes, that was the whole IRA problem. That war continued up until about 15 or 20 years ago. Okay, so that stuff just doesn't go away anytime soon. The legislative authority, the Crown and Parliament, has three separate elements: the monarchy, the House of Lords, and the House of Commons. We talked about that already. The Crown does have executive powers, which do not depend on Parliament, including the power to make treaties, declare war, award honors, and appoint officers and civil servants. Now, in practice, these are always exercised by the monarch on the advice of the Prime Minister and on other ministers of His Majesty's government. The Prime Minister and government are directly accountable to Parliament, although its control of public finances and the public through the elections of members of Parliament. Now, the monarch also appoints the Prime Minister, who then forms a government from members of the Houses of Parliament. This must be someone who can command a majority in a confidence vote in the House of Commons. In the past, the monarch has occasionally had to make judgments, but today, the ongoing Prime Minister advises the monarch of who should be offered the position. So once upon a time, what they used to do is the king would appoint the Prime Minister, but for many, many, many years, I mean, he still does, she still does, but it's more or less ceremonial. So the king can declare war, but he never does. So in theory, the king has a ton of power, but really not so much. Now, we talked about the two divisions of the House of Lords. They're called the Lords Spiritual and the Lords Temporal. The Lords Spiritual, they're basically made up of senior diocesan bishops, and they're ranked in the order of consecration. And it's also buddies of the king. Okay, but again, they have limited power. They have limited veto power, actually. So they're almost largely ceremonial. Now, the Lords Temporal, that's the life peers created under the Appellate Jurisdiction Act of 1876 and the Life Act of 1958. And basically, that just says, look, these are going to be buddies of the king, buddies of the bishops, members of the Church of England. That's the Lords Temporal. So then the House of Commons, of course, that's elected by the people. There's 650 constituencies in the United Kingdom. Each constituency, district we would call it, has about 65,000, 66,000 voters, and they elect their constituencies. Who forms the government? The ones with the majority of constituencies. In other words, 650 constituencies, the party that controls 326 of them, they have the majority. They can elect the Prime Minister. In the UK, though, they have more than two parties, and if one party doesn't get the majority, they have to form a coalition government with one of the other parties, like Labour or Green or one of the other fringe parties, so they can come up with the 326 constituencies, the majority. They can then form a government. Okay, that's how it works over in the UK. So it's in fact, all legislation has to be passed by the House of Commons to become law, and the House of Commons also controls taxation and the supply of money to the government. And again, the Chancellor of the Exchequer serves at the pleasure of the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister is appointed by the House of Commons, and that's how it works. The system of government in the UK is not unlike ours. And again, it's the mother of all parliaments. It's the mother of all governments. It's basically how most free governments operate today. Kind of how ours does too, okay? We don't have a House of Commons and a House of Lords. We have a Senate and a House. Our president is elected separately. Theirs is appointed by the ruling party. What else is different? We don't have a king or queen, but theirs is largely ceremonial. But other than that, it's very similar. In fact, there's a real good chance that, and I tell my British friends this all the time, even my Canadian friends, I said, you understand that had you not taxed our tea, there would be a good chance that our money would still have a picture of Her Majesty on it. In other words, we'd still be part of the British Empire. But you taxed our tea. We didn't like it. We had a revolution. We won. You lost. We're now king of the castle, and you guys, not so much. Is that being conceited and arrogant? Maybe. Don't mean to be that way, but that's just the way things are. So I hope you know just a little bit about British politics. I hope you know just a little bit about Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, who, by all indications, the guy's going to do a good job. He's very sharp. He's very popular. And he used to be Chancellor of the Exchequer. In other words, he used to control the purse strings. Okay? And remember what James Carville said. And it doesn't matter if it's American politics, British politics, even Chinese politics. It's the economy, stupid. In fact, I'll go off on one tangent before we wrap it up. President or Prime Minister, President, whatever he is, Xi over in China, just kind of threw the opposition in jail and escorted the old prime minister out the door and said, you know what? I know what the Constitution says. I can only serve for 2 terms, but guess what? I'm your new prime minister for the next term and probably until I die. Right now, the Chinese people are putting up with that because the economy is good in China. China is in big trouble when it comes to their monetary everything. They show growth. Every economist in the world who's not from China says, you know what, these numbers are just made up and fake. They've got ghost cities everywhere that they can't put people in. Their population is stagnant at best because of their one-child policy. And the people in China will tolerate Xi's BS until they can't buy designer purses anymore, until they can't buy new cars, until they can't do the fun stuff that we in the West are doing. So even to the Chinese, I don't know how to say it in Mandarin, but if I could, I'd say it's the economy, stupid, everywhere. And the UK has a new prime minister who's the top money man in the country. I think they'll be just fine. Well, that's it. We're done. JamesStrongShow@hotmail.com. Please send your comments to my email. I appreciate that. I really do. In fact, I'm getting more comments. I get comments every week, and I do respond to all those comments. I appreciate it. Most of my comments come via email, some on Facebook, some via Facebook Messenger. All those are fine. Okay, they're all fine. But I appreciate the input. And please, if you would, share the podcast with your friends. If you got a buddy, a pal, family member, send them the link and say, hey, listen to this knothead and see what you think. That's how we build the podcast. That's how we build an audience. And who knows? I might even monetize this thing one day. Stay tuned for that. Well, that's it. I'm done. Until next time, this is James Strong saying adios.